The night smelled of burning cedar and desperation. Across Rome, embers swirled like dying fireflies as the great fire gnawed through the city's heart, reducing temples to blackened skeletons and homes to ash. The streets choked with smoke, the air thick with the screams of those too slow to flee and the curses of those who'd stopped to loot what little remained. But high on the Palatine Hill, Emperor Nero watched the destruction with a poet's gaze, his lyre cradled against his chest like a lover. Some said he sang as Rome burned, not dirges but ballads of Troy's fall, as if the carnage below were merely a stage for his art. And then he saw the boy, a slight figure moving through the chaos, no older than 15, with the kind of beauty that made even hardened soldiers pause, delicate as a cameo carving, with eyes too large for his face, and a mouth that seemed carved for whispered secrets. Nero's fingers stilled on the lyre strings, and that moment, the emperor, who had kicked his pregnant wife to death months before, who kept her corpse preserved in honey like a perverse relic, saw not a person, but a solution. By dawn, the boy had a new name, Sporus, a new identity, Empress, and a new body, reshaped by imperial decree. The surgeon came at dusk, his instruments gleaming in the lamplight. Nero had specified the requirements: no crude hacking, no peasant's butcher work. This was to be a refinement, like pruning a rose or tuning a lyre. The boy's screams echoed through the marble halls, but the slaves knew better than to react. When it was done, Nero himself inspected the results, tilting Sporus's sweat-slick face toward the light. The boy's pupils were blown wide with pain, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Perfect, Nero murmured, thumb brushing the split skin of Sporus's lower lip. The word hung in the air like a curse. They dressed him in Poppeia's silks for the wedding feast. The fabric slithered against his skin like a living thing, the gold embroidery biting into his wrists where the sleeves dragged. Nero had ordered the cosmetic applied with particular care: malachite for the eyelids, powdered lead to blanch the skin, crushed mulberry for the lip. The effect was grotesque, a living doll with glassy eyes, his youthful features smothered under the mask of a dead woman. The banquet hall stank of roasted peacock and hypocrisy. Senators in their bleached togas raised cups to the happy couple, their smiles straining at the corner. A particularly drunk poet compared Sporus to Persephone plucked from the underworld, which earned him a villa in Antium. Nero fed his new bride honeyed figs with his own fingers, cooing endearments meant for Poppeia's ears. Every time the emperor's hand strayed too low on Sporus's waist, the boy's breath hitched just slightly, but his face remained smooth as the pearls around his throat. Later, when the guests had staggered home and the slaves had doused the lamps, Nero took his time. The bedchamber smelled of saffron and spoiled wine, the sheets sticking to Sporus's thighs where the surgical wounds wept through their dressings. The emperor's touch was meticulous, a collector inspecting his latest acquisition. "You'll learn to enjoy this," Nero promised when Sporus shuddered. Outside, a nightingale sang in the cypress trees, its melody threading through the boy's choked whimpers. By morning, Sporus had learned his first lesson. In Nero's Rome, survival wasn't about resistance. It was about becoming invisible in plain sight, a ghost wrapped in silk, screaming silently behind painted lips. He lay very still as slaves bathed him, their sponges skirting the bruises. One girl, younger than the others, let her fingers linger in sympathy on his wrist. Sporus met her gaze for less than a heartbeat, before the overseer's lash cracked across her shoulder. That night, when Nero called for him again, Sporus walked to the imperial bedchamber without being dragged. His steps were steady, his hands didn't shake, and deep in the pit of his stomach, beneath the pain and the shame, something cold and sharp began to take root. The fire had burned Rome to the ground. But fires, as Nero would learn, have a way of spreading. The mornings always began with pain. Sporus woke to the scent of rose oil and the rustle of slave girls moving through the pre-dawn gloom, their bare feet whispering against marble as they prepared his bath. The water was too hot, scented with lavender to mask the metallic tang of blood, still seeping from the wounds between his thighs. He no longer screamed when they lowered him into the steaming pool, though his fingers turned white where they gripped the edges. The oldest slave, a Gaulish woman with scarred wrists, would murmur stories as she worked, tales of her homeland's green hills, of spirits that lived in waterfalls, anything to distract him from the ritual of cleansing his broken body. By the third month, he could sit through the entire bath without making a sound. Breakfast was served in the east portico, where the rising sun gilded the columns and made Nero's wine cup glow like molten gold. The emperor liked to watch Sporus eat, his dark eyes tracking every movement of the boy's throat as he swallowed honeyed milk and figs. "You're too thin," Nero would chide, pressing a thumb into the hollow above Sporus's collarbone. Then he'd force-feed him dates stuffed with almonds, laughing when the boy gagged on their sweetness. The court poets called these moments tender. The slaves knew better. The lessons started at midday. Poppaea's former attendants arrived like a flock of carrion birds, their perfumes clashing as they circled Sporus where he sat stiffly on a gilded chair. They taught him to walk with his hips swaying just so, the way Poppaea had when she wanted to draw every eye in the room. A matron with a face like a dried apple made him practice sitting with his knees pressed together for hours, slapping his thighs with a reed when they sagged apart. "An empress doesn't sprawl like a dockside whore," she'd hiss, her breath smelling of sour wine. The most vicious was a freedwoman named Livia, who forced Sporus to recite poetry while balancing a scroll on his head. If it fell, she'd pinch the soft skin of his inner arm, until tears welled in his eyes, but never enough to smudge the coal. Nero preferred his tears to be decorative. The afternoons were for religious farces. Draped in Poppaea's saffron veil, Sporus played the part of empress in ceremonies meant for Vestal virgins. He poured libations to Venus with hands that didn't shake, his voice soft and high as he recited prayers Nero had rewritten to mock the god. The priests' faces were stone, but their eyes burned with humiliation as they bowed to this castrated boy, playing at womanhood. Once during the Floralia, Nero made him dance barefoot on rose petals, while senators tossed coins at his feet. The petals stuck to the blood on his soul. Nightfall brought the emperor's attentions. Nero's moods were as unpredictable as summer storms. Some evenings he'd cradle Sporus in his lap like a child, stroking his hair as he rambled about the epic he was composing. Other nights he'd fly into rages over imagined slights. A glance held too long, a hesitation before obeying. Once, when Sporus flinched from his touch, Nero backhanded him so hard the pearls from his headdress scattered across the floor like tea. The next morning, the emperor gifted him a necklace of Ethiopian opals to cover the bruising. It was during these months that Sporus learned the art of disappearance. He let his mind drift during the worst moments, floating somewhere above his body. As Nero poured at him, he memorized the patterns of the frescoed ceiling, the fat putti with their lyres, the grapevines that twisted into the shape of screaming faces. He counted the tiles on the floor, 327 in the bedchamber, 49 in the bathing room, and the steps between his quarters and the garden, 78 if he took the long route past the shrine to Apollo. And he began to steal. Small things at first. A silver spoon slipped into his sash during feasts, a handful of coins from Nero's abandoned purse, then more dangerous trophies, a key ring lifted from a drunken guard, a stylus left behind by a scribe. The greatest prize came on the Ides of March, when Nero hosted a banquet to celebrate the anniversary of Poppaea's death. Sporus, draped in her favorite sea-green stola, was made to lie motionless on a bier, while guests tossed roses onto his corpse. As the wine flowed, he slipped away to the emperor's private chambers, where a loose floorboard near the bed yielded Poppaea's diary. The pages smelled of honey and bitter almonds. He made me kneel in barley until my skin split. The child quickened once more today. I pray to Juno it's a girl. Sporus tucked the tablet back just as a shadow fell across the doorway. The palace peacock stood there, its tail fanned in a mockery of imperial splendor. Nero had gifted the bird after discovering it could mimic human speech, mostly curses and snippets of lewd song. Its beady eyes fixed on Sporus as he straightened, his heart hammering against his ribs. For a long moment, neither moved. Then the bird let out a screech that sounded uncannily like laughter and strutted away. That night, Sporus lay awake long after Nero's snores filled the chamber. Through the open window came the distant wail of a cat in heat, the murmur of guards changing shifts. His fingers traced the outline of the hemlock vial he'd stolen from the physician's stores, hidden now beneath a loose tile near his pillow. Outside, the peacock screamed again, and Sporus smiled. The first whispers of rebellion reached Rome on a morning thick with the stench of burning sacrifices. Nero was performing as Orestes in the palace theatre when the messenger arrived, his face streaked with dust from the Via Flaminia. The play stopped mid-scene as the emperor snatched the dispatch, his painted brows furrowing over smudged coal. For a heartbeat, the court held its breath. Then Nero threw back his head and laughed, a sound like shattering glass. Finally, he crowed, crushing the parchment in his fist. A drama worthy of my talents. The senators exchanged glances. They'd seen this madness before, when Nero rebuilt Rome after the fire, when he raced chariots through the streets at night. But this was different. Galba, the grizzled governor of Hispania, had declared himself emperor. 3 legions were marching toward Rome, and Nero was delighted. He spent that afternoon staging tableaux of famous battles in the banquet hall, using sugared almonds to represent troops and overturned wine cups for city. Sporus, draped in a makeshift cloak of purple silk, was made to play victory, standing on a table while Nero pushed the almonds around with a dagger. You see, the emperor giggled, his breath reeking of fermented fish sauce. They'll break against my walls like waves. But the walls were already crumbling. As Nero composed odes to his coming triumph, Sporus moved through the palace like a shadow. He lingered near half-open doors during military briefings, memorizing the locations of grain stores and weak points in the city's defenses. He slipped into the archives after dark, tracing supply routes on maps with his fingertip. Once, while Nero bathed, he swapped a sealed letter bound for Gaul with a fake, its wax seal expertly replicated using the emperor's own ring. The ring never left Nero's finger, except when he slept. Their last night together began like so many others, with wine and violence. Nero was in a black mood, having learned that the Praetorian Guard had stopped saluting his statues. He forced Sporus to kneel on raw barley while he ranted about ingratitude, his spittle flecking the boy's face. "After all I've given them," he shrieked, overturning a table of rare citrus fruits. "Music, beauty, and this is how they repay me." Sporus stayed perfectly still, his knees burning as the barley grains bit into his flesh. He'd learned this too, how to let pain wash over him without flinching, how to bury his screams where no one could hear them. When Nero collapsed into drunken sobs, he even gathered the emperor into his arms, stroking his sweaty curls as if comforting a child. "We'll show them," Nero slurred against his chest. "When they come, we'll die together. Like heroes. Like..." His voice trailed off into a wet snore. Sporus waited until the snores deepened before extracting himself. He moved silently to the window, where the first hint of dawn tinged the sky the color of a fresh bruise. Somewhere beyond the city walls, Galba's army was marching. Somewhere in the palace, a Gaulish slave girl was hiding a bundle of stolen clothes beneath her pallet. And in Nero's bedchamber, the imperial signet ring slid easily from the emperor's limp finger. Sporus paused at the door, looking back at the man who'd remade him into a doll, a widow, a ghost. Nero lay sprawled in a pool of wine and his own vomit, his laurel wreath askew, one hand still clutching the dagger he'd sworn to use on himself. For a heartbeat, Sporus considered returning, not to kiss him farewell, but to drive that dagger between his ribs. Instead, he turned away. Some deaths were too kind. The peacock watched from the courtyard as he vanished into the maze of servants' passages, its tail feathers rustling like a conspirator's robes. By the time Nero woke, screaming for his missing bride, Sporus was halfway to the Appian Gate, his stolen cloak pulled low over his hennaed hair. Behind him, Rome burned again. The road to Galba's camp was paved with the detritus of a crumbling empire, abandoned supply carts with broken axles, the bones of horses picked clean by vultures, and always the refugee. They moved in shuffling lines along the Via Flaminia, their faces hollowed by hunger, their belongings strapped to their backs like tortoise shells. Sporus walked among them, his stolen cloak frayed at the edges, his feet wrapped in rags to hide their softness. The imperial signet ring hung heavy around his neck on a leather cord, hidden beneath layers of grime and sweat. He'd learnt the value of dirt in those first days after fleeing Rome. It was the perfect disguise, streaked across his cheeks, matted in his hair, ground into the pores of his hands, until no one would look twice at the delicate bones beneath. Even the henna rinses he'd used to darken his hair had faded to a muddy brown, indistinguishable from any other starving peasants. Only his eyes might have betrayed him, too large, too knowing, but he kept them downcast, his shoulders hunched in practiced submission. Galba's sentries nearly killed him at the perimeter. One moment he was shuffling forward with a group of displaced farmers. The next, a spear point pricked his throat as a grizzled centurion barked, "You, boy, what's your business here?" Sporus let his voice tremble, not entirely an act, given the blade at his neck. "Mercy, Domine, I bring news from Rome." The centurion's laugh smelled of rotten teeth. "News? From that nest of vipers?" His grip tightened on the spear. Last beggar who said that was a Neronian spy. We nailed him to choose. Sporus dropped the act. Straightening, he reached into his tunic, slowly, so as not to startle the guards, and drew out the signet ring. The morning sun caught the engraved eagle, making it seem to flare to life as he pressed it into the dirt at the centurion's feet. "Tell your emperor," he said, his voice clear now, "that Nero's widow begs an audience." The camp erupted. Within minutes, Sporus found himself dragged past rows of leather tents, soldiers jeering and reaching out to tug at his clothes. Someone threw a clod of dirt that struck his cheekbone. Another spat at his feet. He kept his face blank, his breathing even, though his pulse hammered like a trapped bird. Galba received him in a commandeered villa, its frescoes of dancing nymphs clashing with the maps and weapon racks, now crowding the atrium. The would-be emperor sat on a folding campaign chair, his purple cloak deliberately frayed at the hem to show modesty. Up close he smelled of leather and cold ambition, his gnarled hands resting on his knees like talons. "So," Galba's voice was a dry rasp, "the whore of the palate." Sporus knelt, not the deep prostration Nero had demanded, but a calculated half-bow that kept his eyes level with Galba's. "The survivor," he corrected softly. A murmur ran through the assembled officers. Galba's lips thinned, but something flickered in his milky eyes. Curiosity, perhaps, or greed. What followed was a dance as intricate as any palace ritual. Sporus parceled out his secrets like a merchant selling spices, just enough to whet the appetite. Nero's troop dispositions along the Tiber, the names of senators secretly loyal to the old regime, the location of 3 hidden treasury vaults beneath the Circus Maximus. With each revelation, Galba's advisors leaned closer, their eyes gleaming, but Sporus kept the best cards hidden. He didn't mention the duplicate seal he'd forged in a slave's quarters, nor the list of Praetorian officers whose loyalty could be bought. He certainly didn't speak of the small lethal vial still sewn into his sack. By nightfall he had a tent of his own, a guard at the entrance, ostensibly for protection, though they both knew it was a cage, and a new role, Galba's living proof of Nero's degeneracy. The old emperor paraded him at dinners like a captured exotic beast, forcing him to recount humiliations while generals drank and laughed. Sporus obliged, spinning tales of golden cages and forced performances, but he carefully edited the story. No mention of the stolen documents, the swapped letters, the quiet network of slaves who'd helped him survive. When asked directly about the castration, he touched his throat and pretended to faint. Galba loved that. Meanwhile, Rome fell. News came in fragments. Nero's panicked flight, his hysterical declaration that he was an artist dying before his time, the final messy suicide in some filthy villa outside the city. Sporus listened to each report with the same detached interest one might show a play whose ending was already known. Only once did he react. A messenger, his face alight with gossip, described how Nero's last words had been, "Sporus, my love, forgive me." The entire command tent erupted in laughter. Someone threw a grape that bounced off Sporus's shoulder. He sat perfectly still, his face a mask of beaten gold, but beneath the table, his nails bit into his palms until blood welled in the crescents. That night, Galba summoned him. The old man sat naked in his bath, his sagging flesh floating like pale seaweed in the scented water. "Well, boy," he rasped, scrubbing at imagined dirt. "Your monster is dead." Sporus said nothing. Galba's eyes dropped to the ring still hanging around the boy's neck. "That belongs to Rome now." Sporus handed it over without protest, but later when the camp slept, he dug up a hidden pouch containing something far more valuable. Nero's private seal stolen weeks ago and carefully duplicated. The original might be gone, but wax wouldn't know the difference. As dawn broke over the rebel camp, Sporus allowed himself one small smile. Emperors came and went. Survivors adapt. The lighthouse beam swept across the harbor, like the finger of a god, its golden light catching the foam of breaking waves before sliding over the rooftops of Alexandria. From her balcony, Demetria watched its slow arc, a cup of Egyptian wine cradled in her hand. The vintage was finer than anything she'd tasted in Rome, light and floral, with none of the leaden sweetness Nero had favored. She took a slow sip, savoring the way it stung the scar on her lower lip. Inside, the girls were giggling over their lessons. 7 merchants' daughters, none older than 14, sprawled across cushions in the study room, their heads bent together as they practiced translating Sappho's verses. Demetria had chosen the house for its acoustics, the way sound carried from the street below, the creak of the stairs that announced visitors long before they reached the door, and for the hidden alcove behind the bathing chamber, where a false wall concealed a chest. Inside lay the relics of another life, a dagger, with a pearl-inlaid hilt, a collection of wax seals wrapped in linen, a lock of auburn hair tied with silk. The girls thought their tutor eccentric but harmless, a widow who'd fled the chaos of Rome, her tragic past hinted at but never explained. They adored her for the way she taught them to read, not just poetry but men's faces, not just Greek but the language of power. Tonight, fireworks burst over the royal quarter, their explosions echoing off the marble facade. One of the girls, little Tyas, the spice merchant's daughter, let out a squeak and dropped her stylus. Demetria didn't flinch. The sound was too much like burning cities, like the screams of a mob storming the Palatine. But the girls were watching, so she merely set down her wine and said, "It's only the prefect celebrating his birthday. The noise can't hurt you." Tyas bit her lip. "My father says Rome is burning again, that they've had 4 emperors in a year." A murmur ran through the group. Demetria felt their eyes on her, the way they always did when Rome was mentioned. As if expecting some revelation, she smoothed her sea-green stola, a different shade than Poppeia's. She'd made sure of that, and smiled. "Rome always burns," she said, "and always rebuilds itself from the ashes." Later, after the girls had gone and the slaves had banked the hearth, Demetria stood before her bronze mirror. The face that looked back was both familiar and strange, the sharp cheekbones softened by time, the henna in her hair almost convincing against the silver threads. Only the eyes were unchanged, too large, too knowing. From the harbor came the cry of night fishermen hauling in their net. Somewhere beyond the lighthouse's reach, ships were sailing toward Rome, carrying news and goods, and fresh lies for new emperors. Demetria touched the reflection's lips, remembering another face that had stared back from polished silver, a boy's face painted for a wedding that had been a funeral in disguise. The past was a knife, but she'd learned to hold it by the blade. Turning from the mirror, she blew out the lamp and climbed into bed. The dagger beneath her pillow pressed its familiar shape against her palm as she closed her eyes. Outside, the lighthouse beam swept on, illuminating, releasing, moving forward, as all things